The original Spyro the Dragon was a fantastic game. I won't go into too much detail into why that is since I already made a video talking about it, but the game is an excellent combination of simplistic and satisfying gameplay and calming atmospheres. Where other platformers are brutal tests of skill and patience, pushing you to the very brink of losing your sanity, Spyro the Dragon is more like spending a relaxing weekend in a tropical resort. And while that may not be what everyone is looking for in a collectathon or platformers more generally, it certainly delivers a delightful experience that can be best described as a vibe. But it wasn't perfect. It was a bit repetitive in its gameplay and environments, and its boss fights were about as threatening as a single marshmallow. If it had a bit more variety and challenge, it would be more deserving of its praise. Luckily, Spyro wasn't a one and done type of situation. Rather than developing an amazing experience and then immediately tossing it away like a used condom, Insomniac Games had another go with Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, which was called Spyro 2 Gateway to Glimmer in Europe and Australia, for some fucking reason. As with every sequel, Spyro 2 was an opportunity to take the successes of the original game and make them even better, as well as fixing any mistakes the original had. In this case, Spyro 2 needed to amplify the enjoyment of collecting everything, while also including some more variety in gameplay and level themes and making the game a bit less of a cakewalk. I know these games were made for babies, but even babies need to be challenged and exposed to new things, or else how will they ever grow into strong, competent, contributing members of society? Do you think civilizations are built off of inexperience and ineptitude? That humanity has achieved so many things simply because they were easy? Do you? Well, you're wrong! Spyro 2 doesn't need to be tough as nails, but it needs to challenge its players more than the first game did, as well as give them more to do than run around and pick things up. So, is Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage an improvement over its predecessor? Let's discuss. Spyro 2, much like every other game in existence, starts with an opening cutscene to explain the story. In the first game, the story wasn't really that important. There was a beginning and an ending, but that was it. It didn't have any actual substance and didn't develop at all over the course of the game. In Spyro 2, the story is more involved. There are actually events that happen. There's progression. So many of these early 3D platformers have about the same amount of compelling narrative as a manual for a coffee machine, so it's nice to see that Spyro 2 made a bit more of an effort to tell a story. But I can't help but feel bad for Spyro. In the first game, he was the sole survivor of an attempt at dragon genocide, and he was forced to venture across all these different worlds to free his dragon brethren from being trapped in crystal statues, and he did that all alone. That's already a pretty fucked up thing to happen to a dragon who's supposedly very young and immature. But then Spyro 2 takes it even further. Spyro just wants to go to the beach. He just wants a little holiday. That's all. But that's taken from him because instead of finding himself at the beach, he finds himself kidnapped by total strangers, and they force him to fight against Ripto, who is openly racist towards dragons. It's just messed up. Leave this poor purple lizard alone. Spyro's mental health and well-being aside though, the story is handled much better in Spyro 2 than in the first game. The setup is done well, there's progression, the characters are much more relevant and involved, which to be fair wasn't hard to do, since there are hardly any important characters in the first game anyway, but you get what I mean. It's a general improvement. What I also like is that each individual level has its own little story as well. I mean, they're nothing too special, usually just the same group of creatures bullies other group of creatures for no reason thing each time. But when you really think about it, isn't that just what every story ever written actually is? Like how in the first Spyro game, the story is just Norks bully dragons. Or how in Titanic, an iceberg bullies a giant cruise ship. Or how generally in real life, it's the wealthy bully the poor. X bullies Y truly is what all storytelling is based on. It is the bedrock of narrative literature. So I can't fault Spyro 2 on using a winning formula for its side stories. I'd say overall, the story and general world building are better in Spyro 2 than in the first game. There's more going on, the recurring characters like Allura, Hunter, the Professor and Moneybags all serve purpose, and Ripto is a decent antagonist even if he's a fairly generic and one-dimensional villain. It's an undeniable improvement. What's also an undeniable improvement is the presentation. The music was great in the first game, but I think it's much better here in Spyro 2. The hub world themes leave a lot to be desired. They're sort of just mystical ambience. They kind of sound like a bunch of constantly ringing wind chimes. It's not the best, but it could be worse. And besides, the actual level themes more than make up for it. They're bouncier and more memorable than the first game's music, which is great. It's going to make it a lot easier to pick out background music for this video. In terms of the visuals, Spyro 2 looks very similar to the first game, just with more detail. But what's really important is that there's so much more variety in the environments. One of my biggest complaints with the first game was that while the environments looked great, they were very samey. There were lots of grassy plains and especially lots of castles. So many castles, it was ridiculous. There aren't even that many castles in Europe. It meant that out of all the levels in the game, only a precious few were in any way unique or distinctive. Spyro 2 did the right thing by making every level feel completely different. Rather than castles and castles and castles, Spyro 2 has mines, beaches, temples, underwater cities, volcanoes, deserts, all kinds of stuff. My favourite has got to be Haruko's. I just love the weirdly serene and calming nature of the thunderstorm. I will admit though, some of the themes are a bit too unique, like Robotica Farms and Metropolis. Not sure about the whole futuristic robot thing in a game based in a fantasy world. I don't really think it fits, but it's no big deal. It is a fantasy world after all. Anything goes in a fantasy world, so why not chuck in some robots? I'm just glad to be able to look at something other than castles in a Spyro game. The presentation in Spyro 2 hit the perfect balance of retaining the charm of the first game while adding in some much needed diversity and memorability, so it's got my seal of approval. But now we've got to talk about the gameplay. I praised the first Spyro game for being one of the most relaxing and satisfying games I've ever played. Its simplicity meant that playing was a stress-free experience, and because of that, I couldn't resist going for 100% completion. However, it was admittedly somewhat repetitive. As fun as running around collecting gems was, I did occasionally find myself wishing for something with a bit more substance. Spyro 2 has quite the task ahead of it. It needs to retain the satisfying and simplistic nature of the first game, while expanding upon it to make the gameplay experience more dynamic and interesting. If the balance between them isn't perfect, it could mean that the whole game is a complete disaster, bringing unimaginable destruction, pain and ruin upon those who play it, as well as, dare I say, the world. No pressure, let's see how it did. The core of the gameplay in Spyro 2 is pretty much exactly the same as the first game. You control Spyro running around picking up gems, gliding from platforms using flame attacks and charge attacks to destroy containers and enemies alike. Very little has changed in that regard. The only main difference to how Spyro plays is that if you press triangle while gliding, he'll do a little flutter jump rather than dropping like a sack of shit like he did in the first game. He also has some other abilities that you can unlock as you progress through the game, but I'll get to that later. For the vast majority of the game, Spyro will use his abilities to traverse and explore a variety of levels in search of collectibles, just as he did in the first game. Tick, no problems there. Everything I liked about the gameplay in the original game is present in this game as well. So how does Spyro 2 expand on this to make it a more interesting gameplay experience? Well, in addition to looking for gems, Spyro is also on the hunt for talismans and orbs. Rather than just simply lying around in levels, talismans and orbs are earned by completing certain objectives. Most talismans can be earned by reaching the end of a level, but orbs are usually locked behind some kind of special mission, and most of them are pretty fun. They could involve killing a bunch of annoying goblin things, protecting NPCs from being eaten alive, winning a game of ice hockey, pretty much anything. I'm mostly in favour of this. They add a refreshing extra layer to the gameplay, it means there's more to the game than simply running around collecting things, and that in turn makes it more interesting to play. They even give more depth to the speedway levels, which is great. The reason I say I'm mostly in favour of this and not completely in favour of this is because some of the orb missions are, well, complete shit. There are some that are just bad. The most infamous one is the trolley in Breeze Harbour simply because it is so easy to fail at. The amount of times I've heard trouble with the trolley A is ridiculous. There are some other dodgy vehicles as well, such as Hunter's Manta Ray, and some missions that are just plain garbage, like the stealth mission in Cloud Temples, or rounding up the Cowlicks in Zephyr. They're just tedious. Thankfully, the good missions drastically outnumber the bad missions, which is a positive. They make the gameplay more dynamic and overall more enjoyable. Speaking of making the gameplay more dynamic, Spyro also has access to new abilities, some temporary, some permanent. Let's start with the temporary abilities. In most levels you'll find these strange looking gate things which grant you temporary power-ups. To unlock them you need to harvest enough of your enemy's souls and they'll grant you a certain temporary ability such as flight, super flame breath, invincibility, that sort of thing. They'll usually play into either traversing the level, completing an orb challenge, or maybe even both. Just like the orbs, they add an extra layer to the gameplay and make things more interesting. No complaints there. Spyro can also unlock permanent abilities throughout the game, swimming, climbing and head bashing. Swimming and climbing are mainly for traversal. Rather than just being stuck to running around on the ground, you can now explore underwater and climb up to places that would otherwise be unreachable. Head bashing allows Spyro to destroy certain objects from above using his head, which honestly doesn't actually add all that much, but it's better than nothing. Just like the temporary abilities and the orbs, they add an extra layer to the gameplay and make things more interesting. Some complaints there. I don't have any issues with swimming, climbing, and head bashing in isolation. As moves, they're absolutely fine. What I don't like is that you unlock them as you progress through the game, but they're required for the 100% completion in most levels, so there'll be levels that are impossible to 100% complete on your first run through. I know that seems like such a minor thing, but what I loved about the first game was that in every level you could find everything on your first visit. Completion was not locked behind abilities you don't yet have. You could clear out every level as you went, never having to revisit them. It was a smoother road to fully completing the game, and it was satisfying to do. I don't like leaving tasks unfinished, and having to leave those early levels unfinished because I'm missing a handful of orbs and gems because I didn't have the right abilities yet was painful. I hated that, it's not satisfying at all. I suppose you can look at it in two ways. On one hand, requiring certain abilities means you'll have a reason to return to levels you've been to before, which is something you never had a reason to do in the first game. But on the other hand, it's actually kind of discouraging the player from going for 100% completion. That's how it felt to me at least. And it sort of takes away from the appeal of the first game. Not completely, mind you, the game is still fun to fully complete, but it just feels messier. The other thing about unlocking those permanent abilities is that it doesn't even make sense. They're swimming, climbing, and head bashing. Why can't Spyro do all of this from the get-go? Swimming I can kind of understand, since not all people know how to do that, so I can't expect every dragon to know how to do that. But head bashing, and worse yet, climbing a ladder? Who doesn't know how to climb a ladder? Instead of just knowing all of this from the off, Spyro has to learn how to do it by coughing up gems for moneybags. Moneybags doesn't even actually teach Spyro how to do any of this, you just pay him and suddenly you have those abilities. Like, what? That's not how it works. When you go for a swimming lesson, you don't pay for it and then immediately leave because you somehow automatically now know how to do it. You don't learn how to do something the very instant you pay for a lesson. If that was how it worked, I wouldn't have dropped out of university. But within the greater context of the game, this isn't a big deal. Not being able to 100% complete each level in the first run is actually the norm in a lot of games. I just liked being able to do it in the first game. I'm just being a whiny little baby, that's all. It's like being gifted with a brand new car and getting upset because you don't vibe with the letters on its number plate. Really, it doesn't actually matter, it's just a minor thing that bothered me. I also want to take this opportunity to actually appreciate moneybags. In the original game, gems didn't actually serve a purpose other than being collectibles. But in Spyro 2, moneybags will accept the gems you collect in exchange for teaching Spyro new moves, lowering bridges, granting access to new levels. I like it, it means the gems are actually worth something this time around. Oh, I feel like I should also mention the boss fights. They're actually good, especially compared to the pathetic excuses for boss fights in the first game. Crush, Gulp, and Ripto are actually somewhat threatening, and their fights are well designed and pretty fun, especially the final boss against Ripto. Overall, the gameplay in Spyro 2 is a big improvement over the first game. It doesn't deviate from what worked and keeps it very close to the gameplay in the first game, but it expands on it in the right ways by adding new moves and abilities and including fun little side missions and objectives. And really, that sentiment applies to pretty much every aspect of the game. Spyro 2 kept what worked and built on it in the right ways. It did it with the gameplay, but it also did it with the story, which was kept simple, but had a more fleshed out cast of characters and actually had progression. As for presentation, the music and visuals kept the same charm and style as the first game, but improved them by making the music more upbeat and memorable, and showing off a wider range of environments and level themes. It's really hard to fault this game. The only thing I really didn't like was not being able to fully complete every level on the first run, which kind of damaged how satisfying the game was to play, and there was also the odd rubbish orb mission here and there. Personally, I will always prefer to play the first Spyro game, but objectively, I cannot deny that Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage is a fantastic improvement over its predecessor and an incredible game in its own right.